Thanks, Jill, and thanks everybody for attending. I'm just going to do a brief intro today. Normally you guys are probably accustomed to hearing me talk about the entire subject, but today we decided that for this one we wanted to have somebody who is deep in the thick of things when it comes to assessments. This sort of thing's important. How do you really know what you need to do and what direction you need to take when it comes to managing risks? How do you know what your exposure levels are, what kind of investments you need to make, where the potential risks are, what you can do and what you can't do, so on and so forth? I mean, the bottom line is without having regular assessments, whether it's just basic assessment for best practices all the way to sophisticated standards and compliance-based assessments, we have to take these steps in order to really come up with a goal and a plan to continue to deal with these evolving risks. So at any rate, we invited Sam from Edwards Performance to join us. They're a valuable partner. We've worked with them in the past when it comes to making sure our clients get their assessment needs and get them on the path to actually achieving a greater risk profile. And so we have him here, and he's going to go through some stuff, sort of walking you through what some of the common questions about assessments. And then we're going to do some Q&A in the end where we can open up the floor and answer anything you like. So if you have any questions today, make sure you put them in the chat. As we go, we'll make sure we address it at the end. And with all that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Sam and let him talk to you. So Sam, you're ready to go. Kick us off. Thanks.
All righty. Good morning, everybody. As Ben mentioned, name here is Sam Bell. I've been with Edwards Performance Solutions for about 3 years now. Prior to that, was with T. Rowe Price for over 16 years, where I led information security infrastructure projects, as well as oversight information security data analytics, and prior to that did a lot of large project management in both call center, data warehouse environments and the like. So I come to cybersecurity assessments in this space from a sort of a real world background of actually doing things in IT first before coming to assessments, and that's kind of the perspective that I'm going to be bringing to today's presentation. So happy to talk about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, which is cybersecurity assessments, and kind of understanding how they can help you understand where you are and where you need to go and to secure your organization. Information security doesn't happen by accident, right? So I think that's something that we're all aware of, and in this day and age of hearing about a new type of exploit or vulnerability, almost seems like daily, or another advanced persistent threat group that is applying their wares and their techniques. I think we're all aware that information security doesn't happen by accident. You need to have a plan, and you need to understand where you are and where you need to get to in order to secure your information assets. And a lot of that is really understanding where those gaps are, as well as what things you are doing well in your environment. But then the question that everybody does seem to wrestle with is, what does good look like? How do we know that we're doing the right things, that we have the right controls in place, that they're effective enough, and that they complement each other in a way that is going to protect our organization? And we found that doing security control audits, security assessments allows you to really get a good picture of where you are, as well as the work that you have in front of you. So security control frameworks really do a couple things for us. They define what good looks like, and they're going to cover more than just the technical controls. They're also going to cover administrative controls, because in most of these frameworks, what we've seen is that, while there's a lot of focus on what's happening technically and what are your IT staff doing and the types of exercises they're doing there, much of information security comes from also, not just doing these technical controls, but also the administrative controls underneath that tie back to them. So those are going to be things like awareness and training, making sure that you have adequate personnel security, both in the screening of people before you bring them into your environment, as well as in the actual physical security of the environment itself. and that you even have things, such as incident response, which I call out here as administrative, because while it does have technical roots, at the end of the day, how people respond and the actions they take when an incident has been identified it's all about people, and it's all about people knowing what they need to do, who they need to contact, and what the next steps are, and making sure that that response is coordinated across the entire organization. So with that said, we're going to talk a little bit about the assessment process as an overview, and then we're going to take a few minutes just to talk about 2 security control frameworks. There are a lot of them out there. I chose 2 for today's presentation, just for the point of being, relatively brief and keeping it within the hour, but also to kind of focus on 2 that are really, extremely popular, both for defense industrial base clients and people serving the defense industrial base, as well as for corporate entities that maybe don't have that defense requirement. So in general, when you take on an assessment, you're going to have to determine which framework or frameworks you're going to work with. I'm going to talk about 2 today, but there are certainly going to be others that you'll want to take into account as well. You're also going to want to understand what's the scope of the environment. What is the scope of the assessment that you're doing? And there's a number of considerations that we want to take into account there to make sure that you understand exactly what it is you're protecting and how much of your world you're assessing, and maybe in any given slice through. You definitely need to engage your internal teams, and we'll talk a bit about this because it's more than just IT. It's really across your entire organization. All folks who touch or are involved in IT, will be involved in performing the security control assessment and trying to understand where you are and where you need to go. You can do assessments internally. So a lot of folks, some folks may have that capability in-house, but a lot of folks don't. And so for those folks who don't, engaging an organization who is expert in performing security control assessments and whatnot is definitely can be helpful and can really make up a lot of time in terms of getting through the assessment and really determining where you are. Additionally, really providing kind of that third-party validation so that you don't have to worry, are we just looking at things the way we want to see them because that's what we're looking for, and maybe not necessarily we need to get more aggressive in the way we look at ourselves. So third-party assessment organizations definitely very, very helpful with that objectivity. And then you go about conducting the assessment itself. We'll talk a bit about that, some of the steps, what's involved with that. And then coming out of that, obviously, if you do an assessment and don't do anything with the results, if you just take the report, put it in a drawer, it's clearly not doing anybody any good. So from that step, the next piece is to develop plans of action and milestones to close the gaps that you have identified. Basically map out what do you want to do first, second, and third, and then go about closing the gaps. So that's kind of a high level, approach. So let's talk a bit about the frameworks here. And as I mentioned before, I talked about 2. The first one I'm going to talk about is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So the NIST, also known as the CSF, it's ideal for non-defense industrial base organizations, and you'll see why when we talk about the next framework in a second. It addresses organizational and systems and controls, but the thing it also does is it's really focusing on business drivers to drive the cybersecurity activity, and also making sure that risks are taken into account as a part of the organization's overall risk management process. And the nice thing about NIST Cybersecurity Framework is that it comes with a framework core and implementation tiers and profiles, which allow you to tailor the framework to your specific business needs, because one size doesn't necessarily fit all. And especially with organizations of all sizes, there may be some controls that don't apply, or that aren't necessarily relevant to your organization, and CSF allows you to do that. The other framework, which some of you may have heard about, CMMC or NIST 800-171. So the CMMC is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It is actually the follow-on to NIST 800-171, and both of them are really in place to address the protection of federal contract information and controlled unclassified information inside of your organization. So if you are somebody who is a DoD contractor or a DoD subcontractor, if you have the DFARS clause listed there, 252, 204, 7012, it's going to say that you are required to conduct a self-assessment against 800-171 and to report your risk score in the supplier performance risk system that's managed by the Navy. Anybody that has the contract now with 7012 should already have this SPRS score determined and into the system as well. Now, on top of 171, CMMC adds additional rigor. The CMMC 2.0 is presently in rulemaking, but what we've seen so far is that it very, very closely aligns in terms of controls and outcomes with 171. Certified, the one thing that CMMC does add is the addition of certified third-party assessment organizations and assessors. So for certain prioritized acquisitions, depending upon the relative security of the contract itself, or what's underneath what's being produced under contract, some of those will actually require a third-party assessment to be performed to make sure that there is objectivity in that overall process. And CMMC 2.0 also introduces formal training both for assessors as well as for practitioners, and introduces the CMMC accreditation body, which is providing oversight and formal accreditation of the assessment results, as opposed to 800-171, which is just a self-attestation by the leadership of the company. And that is one thing I do want to call out here as we talk about this, is that right now, presently, even if you don't have a contract that's requiring CMMC, if you are making an attestation under 800-171 that you have a particular score and that controls are in place, that is a representation that is being made by the head of the company. And they had better be sure that those controls really are in place. And there are discussions of, places where folks have claimed that they are in compliance with 800-171. Maybe folks found out, or a whistleblower says, hey, yeah, they're not really doing everything they say that they're doing. And then false claims acts can be pursued in that case for, claiming that you have a certain degree of cybersecurity maturity in your organization that you don't really have. So those are just two frameworks. There are a number of others. Another one you may hear a bit about, really more for federal systems, is NIST 853. I didn't mention it here because for purposes of this group, chances are one of these two frameworks is probably more appropriate, but something like 800-153 does also allow us to map to a number of different frameworks because it's much more granular. For example, in the healthcare space, we'll go in and do an 853 assessment and then map that back to the NIST cybersecurity framework and map that back to HIPAA requirements as well. And that way we can do one assessment and hit multiple frameworks in one shot. But for those folks who are new to this and are just looking at, hey, I need to kind of get my arms around where I am and what I need to do, one of these two frameworks is a great place to start. So let's just drill a little bit more into just kind of compare and contrast the two. The thing that's nice about the NIST cybersecurity framework is the way it's structured with its categories and subcategories. So you'll see that they talk about the different stages of what you need to do with information assets. Basically identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover to cyber incidents. So, do you identify and understand what you're protecting? Do you then have access control and awareness and training and data security and maintenance and protective technologies to make sure that, what you are protecting is in fact protected? And then are you able to understand and identify things that are going wrong with detection processes and continuous monitoring? And then from a respond perspective, what do you do about it? Do you have planning and communications around, what you're going to do if you have a cyber incident, who you're going to let know, when do you have to inform authorities, when do you unplug the box from the wall, all those types of efforts that you might do. And then from a recover perspective, if assets need to be rebuilt, data needs to be restored and whatnot, as well as also, from an improvement perspective, what did we learn from this, and making sure that those improvements get baked back into the overall cyber posture. So CSF is really great for organizations that don't have that requirement to protect FCI and CUI, because it really is focused more on the organization and organizational controls rather than the specific protection of FCI and CUI. So as we look at 800.171 CMMC, they have these final control families or domains, depending upon whether it's 171 or CMMC. They call them something a little different, but they're essentially the same controls under the hood. And all of these controls are focused, and a lot of the language is written around making sure that any controlled and classified information or federal contract information is protected, and the language around these controls, since it is a federal reg to protect that type of class of information, is written a little bit more specific to protecting that, as opposed to maybe the overall organizational approach that you would take with NIST CSF. So then now let's take a few minutes and we'll talk about assessment scope. So, how do you decide what to assess? One answer, or the easy answer, let's just assess the entire organization. Sometimes that's not practical. Sometimes that's just way too much to do in one bite. And you may not be able to respond to the things that you identify. So couple things to take into account. Overall, what are your enterprise needs that you have, for understanding where you are and what security controls you have in place and don't. Specific requirements of various organizational units. So you may have a particular team that has a DoD contract that has CUI in it, and so you need to make sure that, hey, that particular group and that organization and all the information and assets that support that group are what's in scope, because maybe you only have a part of your organization that is doing that is handling FCI and CUI, and you can then use that as an opportunity to kind of narrow down the scope and only assess the part of the organization that you think might be handling that type of information. And again, right there, FCI and CUI for federal contracts. Additionally, where you have other types of sensitive information, whether it's proprietary information, public health information, personally identifiable information in the organization. This one is one that I'm sure folks will find may cause you to even have to look at several frameworks, or at least do it in one framework and map to others from a regulatory and compliance perspective. And then also from a budget perspective, how much money do you have to spend to move the needle to get the work done? And is the organization able to react to the assessment and actually take it in and be able to make the changes that are necessary? Or is potentially the organization, it's too big a lift to try to get the entire organization, so you start with one small part of the organization where you're able to get that lift first and then move it across the organization after the fact. And one of the key things to consider here is that as you're making these determinations and as you're looking at these considerations, looking at your network diagrams, but also data flow diagrams, if you have them, and if you don't, they're a great way to kind of identify where is your sensitive information flowing throughout your organization. And the old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. We have found data flow diagramming to be a very effective tool when folks aren't really sure what they need to protect. We can sit down and walk through basically the different types of use cases that folks have in the environment. What are you doing? What type of information are you getting? What are you doing with that information? Map that out pictorially, visually, so that then you can see which pieces of your infrastructure are being impacted or handling what type of information, and then use that then to come back and look at the scope items and figure out what to do with that. The next piece of this, and this is really key, is engaging your internal and your support teams. because how people actually use and support the system is really going to drive how you're doing. Security is not just the responsibility of the technology teams, and I've seen far too many times where assessments may start out and it's like, well, we have all the tech folks there, but the folks who are actually using the system, the folks who are maybe performing privilege functions in the system or whatnot, aren't even brought to the table because they're, quote, just users, end quote. Those just users are really the folks who are making or breaking the company's security, so you have to be sure that you've got them, all them taken into account. And as you look across the organization, you really need to have active participation from your senior leadership, from human resources, physical security, marketing, technology, as well as any third-party support organizations, your MSPs and MSSPs and the like, you know, because those folks are a part of the fabric of your organization. If you have, you know, your IT infrastructure outsourced to, you know, folks, you know, such as DP, then they are a part of the party because they are a part of they're an extension of your company, making sure that you are securing things the way that they need to be secured. So you really want to make sure that you're able to get all these folks in the loop. And then from an assessment team perspective, there's a couple things that you want to go ahead and consider. You know, take a look at your industry, and do you need to have folks who maybe have specific healthcare experience or manufacturing experience, those types of things. You know, and also making sure that those assessors are comfortable with the desired frameworks that you're working in. While, you know, a lot of these things do crosswalk from one to the other, you know, making sure you've got assessors with that kind of deep experience is really going to be key. That when things get gray, that, you know, they understand the framework and different ways that things can be interpreted. And then making sure that the team size, schedule, and whatnot can be is going to align, right? So if a company says, hey, we're going to have 10 people show up to your doorstep and they're going to be here for 2 days, can your organization support that? Or is it going to be the kind of thing where, hey, you know, we need, you know, a couple of weeks of, you know, a few hours of meetings a week in order to get through things, because that's the pace that the organization is going to be able to support. You're going to be asked to gather documentation. You're going to have to, you know, provide interviews and provide system demonstrations. Making sure that you've got adequate time to support all of those things are going to be key. And of course, then you do want to make sure that the assessors are actually a cultural fit within your organization, because, you know, there's a lot of different ways at looking at an assessment. One is, okay, you're bad, you're terrible, you know, you should be punished because you don't have this right, you know, and there are some assessors that kind of go down that rabbit hole or that line of thought. You know, to my mind, you know, assessors are there to help you along, unless it's a formal assessment like a CMMC formal assessment where they're not allowed to help you. In general, you know, the goal and outcome of this is to help you move the ball and move the needle on your security posture. So making sure that the folks that you're working with, when they come with their recommendations and whatnot, are going to be people that you will actually entertain, and that your company will actually entertain the recommendations and the direction that come from the assessment organization. Because if it doesn't feel like a cultural fit from the beginning, chances are when you get to the end, the results that they're in, the outcomes they say to do may not really align, because they look at the world a little differently than you all are. So let's just take a minute or two to talk about some assessment basics. I kind of tipped a little bit to that on the previous slide here, but there's 3 ways to prove the existence of a security control. So it's either examining, which would be things like reviewing system and user documentation, config settings, actually observing the system in use. Interviewing, so actually meeting with the people that perform system, you know, key system management tasks and whatnot, human resources, physical security people, as well as just your average day-to-day user, which is really where much of the day-to-day security lies. And tests, so that would be things like conducting vulnerability scanning and looking for, you know, open ports, improperly secured SSL configurations and the like. doing spot and configuration inspections of your configurations, actually watching things in use, and even testing physical access controls in group memberships and making sure that folks can't execute permissions from as one user into another user's role. And oftentimes for a given control, we may need to have a little bit of everything, right? So the documentation may be the examine artifact that says what should be. The interview is going to say, hey, are people really doing what we said we documented? And test allows us to verify that that the system has actually been configured as we have expected. So as you go through this, hey, I gave you a document may not necessarily be enough, because oftentimes people don't read the documents. So these other interview and test are things that make sure that things are actually in practice, and if they're not, you understand what the nuances are about that. So then from there, I mean, basically that kind of gives you the context of what is happening during an assessment. So let's talk just a little bit about planning and execution here. Obviously, as with any good project, right, upfront planning is key. Making sure you have what you're going to do outlined and the ability to how you're going to communicate it. The other thing is, before you get the assessors on board, any relevant documentation that you think you have, get them to the assessment team as early as possible, because it is a whole lot better to come in having read all the documentation that you have and then start to ask questions than it is to start by asking questions and have somebody say, oh, let me send you the document. By having that documentation early on, it really can kind of frame up, what the questions look like, and let the assessment team do a better job of preparing for each of those individual interviews and make them go as smoothly as possible for your team, especially because some of the folks coming to this party may not really understand why they're there or what they're supposed to contribute. So, having as little fishing expeditions as necessary up front will definitely help things go smoother and help the folks warm to the assessment team faster. The other thing too is understanding who owns what. Who are the control owners for things such as like access control, who grants rights to the system, who has to approve it. And the thing to think about is that oftentimes, people will cover multiple control families or domains. So kind of understanding what they do and how it lays across the framework that you're using will be really kind of key, so that folks know what types of questions to expect and what types of areas that they're going to be asked to produce evidence for, or be asked to, or be interviewed about. And then another thing, and again, this documentation up front really helps with that, getting those key questions, areas of responsibility in advance of the interview out there, so that when folks walk in, they at least have some context as to what is all of this, because there's going to be a lot of questions they probably have never heard before, and maybe some technical questions. So kind of understanding what they're walking into and have a chance to get their arms around it before they go in there will make that go a whole lot easier once you get into the interview session itself, and really is really the best way to kind of show respect for the team and make the best use of everybody's time. And then, you're not going to get it right the first time. So we will have to have time where you have to come back and revisit some controls. The team will go back, start to score against the control framework, see where they are. And then there's going to be open questions. Hey, do you have a document that covers this or that particular nuance of something? So you want to make sure that, in your timing of the plan, you're allowing after that initial set of interviews that you have time for follow-ons and whatnot before the assessment team pulls together their final recommendations. And then once they've got that, the key thing is, okay, what do we do with this? So now we've identified where the gaps are, what we need to improve. The key thing here is, don't just put the report in a drawer. Develop your plans of actions and milestones, and that will outline what you're going to do to address all of the unsatisfied controls. And the key thing here is really, where possible, to organize into projects. So instead of giving somebody, and I'll tell you, we've come off assessments and you'll see you may have 100, 200, 300 POAM line items that come out of a given assessment of how, tweak this, tweak that. That's way too much for anybody to get their arms around. So, And we follow the practice of actually organizing those POAM items into digestible projects that, folks can get their arms around and can kind of understand, because moving the needle and the work that needs to happen afterwards are generally some larger projects. And then you want to prioritize those projects according to risk, as well as taking into account project dependencies. So as an example, if you're a company that is in the defense industrial base space, and you handle controlled unclassified information, as an example, probably one of the first projects you're going to get, if you haven't done it already, is to identify and document and control the flow of controlled unclassified information throughout the organization. And that'll have a whole lot of smaller line items underneath that. Because that is a design step in understanding where your CUI lives, that one is always going to be an extremely high priority, because from a critical path perspective, until you get that out of the way, you don't necessarily know what it is you're protecting. So including those types of considerations as you start to deck up the POAMs is really key. And now one other thing that we do that we recommend is that the initial project recommendations are kept to a manageable size, allowing the organization to do incremental improvements to the security posture over time. We do try to avoid what I'll call throw the baby out with the bathwater or boil the ocean projects. However, the organization may decide that the best approach is to take 5 or 6 of these incremental projects and roll them all up into one large project in order to address things. But we generally recommend not doing that as a going in position, because oftentimes the budgets, you're going to identify things, the budgets may not be there to fix everything. So by making them digestible chunks, then the organization can still move the needle, still move the ball down the field, and at the same time work within the constraints of budget that they have. But there may be times where it makes sense to say, hey, you know what? The best way to address this is let's go stand up a secure enclave for handling CUI information. We're going to put it over here. It's going to be physically and logically isolated from everything else we do. That would not be the kind of incremental project recommendation that we would ever provide. But you may find after you look at the incrementals that might be a cheaper and more effective way to go forward. So as you look at the plans of actions and milestones, take a step back and look at what you've got there, and see are there opportunities where maybe you don't want to go incrementally, but a big lift is actually your best play. And for all these reasons, and we're talking a lot about assignment of resources, we're talking about assignment of funding and whatnot. All of this is why it's critical to have your C-suite involved throughout this process, especially as you're talking about recommendations and next steps, because this is going to require organizational commitment in order to get the gaps closed, and that's only going to happen with the appropriate dollars and resources to make it happen. And then finally, once you've kind of carved up the beast into plans of actions and milestones, you have the foundation for addressing your security weaknesses. Obviously make sure that you get the appropriate resources, budget, and management commitment to close the gaps. Without that, you'll come back around, do the assessment a year from now, and find that you still have some of the same issues open as you go through. One thing that we highly recommend as well is, as you're going through, revisit your assessment and update any of your scores, your evidence, your documentation, and narratives. Basically, catch yourself doing something right here, because you want to make sure that as you have moved the ball forward, that you are closing off your documentation and showing and giving yourself credit for the good work that has been done. That also serves as a baseline for doing reassessments on a regular basis, and which many control frameworks call for regular reassessment. We would recommend doing it on a yearly basis, even if it's just an internal revisit, to make sure that your controls are still in place, effective, and that as you've made changes in technology, maybe that you haven't undone something that was working before. So all things that you want to consider as you close the gap. So that ends my part of the presentation, the narrative part here. So With that, let me turn it back over to Ben and see if you all have any questions. So Ben,
Yeah.
take it away.
Thanks so much, Sam. Really appreciate the expertise. And before we get into questions, I just wanted to do a little more housekeeping. We are going to have a webinar in January, back sort of on our normal schedule. I know with the holidays and such, it's really hard to get things on a normal schedule, but we usually use the last Wednesday of every month. As we go into 2022, we're going to talk about, I may change the title a little bit, but it's going to be about common attacks, how to recognize them, things like that, sort of as we're in 2022, what are the things that my team needs to be aware of most? And we'll talk about phishing, ransomware, all sorts of things. Our contact information is here. You can see both Sam and myself. If you have questions you want to take offline with us, please don't hesitate. We're happy to answer those questions. The assessment stuff is really confusing. There's a lot to dig through, and the truth is that the best way to deal with this stuff is to get started. And once you actually get through these assessments and actually have a plan of action, things tend to get a lot easier once you actually have some clarity. But that's one of the biggest challenges. People don't really know where to start. Anyway, with that, all that said, Jill, what questions do we have?
All right, thanks, Ben. Yes, our first question come in. It is, how often do I need to have a security assessment done?
It depends upon what regulations or which framework that you are going against. But as an example, for 171 CMMC, that requirement would be annually. Now, that can be a self-attestation annually or a self-assessment annually. But that is the frequency they recommend there. Under CSF, I don't believe there is a hard and fast requirement. However, I would come back to, in a year's time, an organization can certainly undo a lot of controls. So I think that a year would be at least for a refresh of your assessment would be a good pace to follow, and is the pace that we follow with a lot of our healthcare partners and whatnot as we work with them to improve their cybersecurity posture. So yearly would be good. Otherwise, you'll start to lose that focus.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And just to tag on to that, I mean, Sam makes some great points there. The reality is that a lot of the organizations that do assessments, oftentimes they're not even necessarily sure what they need to be compliant with, or what level they're at, or something like that. And so, as a good rule, if you're just starting this, think of it like every year you should be doing kind of a checkup on your systems, regardless of your compliance standards. Let's go back, let's see where things are at and what we need to do as the landscape changes. I mean, the things we're talking about, right? I mentioned this January webinar. In January, we're going to talk about today's threats. The landscape has changed just in a year, and I'm sure another year from now we're going to have different considerations. So the good thing to do is to create a structure for a plan. And then if you have to adjust from there, well, that's fine. At least you have sort of the discipline in place. Jill, what other questions do we have?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ben. Okay. Who in my organization needs to be involved in the security assessment?
Yeah, and that is really, it winds up going across the majority of your organization. As I kind of mentioned before, even folks like marketing need to be involved. Because they're the ones that are going to control the posting and the review of content that's out there externally, say on your LinkedIn site or Facebook or whatever you have. So you need to have the involvement of your IT staff, of marketing staff, of HR staff, as well as senior level support from either your CISO. Certainly your CEO has got to be bought into the work that's being done, even if they're not physically there at every session. Basically anybody who is involved in supporting and creating your secure environment are folks that should be involved to some degree, because they're either going to be responsible for a process, responsible for a system, or they're going to be participants. They're going to be using your processes and your systems, and you're going to want to make sure that those folks are staying coloring within the lines, if you will, in the way that they use their system. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I mean, and at the end of the day, you have to have stakeholders involved, people who understand the purpose of the business, why you collect data, the technology experts who manage the data, all that stuff. It's a group process, and in a sense, everybody is responsible for security and management. So we should expect that as part of the process. You can't just sort of say, well, I'm hiring this guy and I'm burying my head in the sand. It's their problem. It's really everybody's problem. The experts are, people like Sam. I always say they're the Sherpas that bring you up the mountain. You're trying to climb Mount Everest. You can't do it by yourself, but you also can't divorce yourself of the effort. So
yeah, one of the biggest mistakes folks make is they think it's purely a technology play, and they say, okay, well, we're going to get our technologists in the room, and that is definitely not the way to go, because probably somebody did an analysis, and like 57% of the controls that are in CMMC/171 are administrative, not technical. Like, do you approve access to the system before you grant access to the system? Those types of things. That is a measurement of management oversight, more than it's necessarily a measurement of, are my tech folks doing things right?
Yep. All right, Jill, any other questions?
We did have one more come in, and it is, what should I look for in a security assessment vendor?
Yeah, so I would say, first, making sure you have a vendor that understands your business, that understands the space you're playing in, understands maybe the regulatory, the regulatory requirements that you're up against, but also has an understanding of kind of the nature of your world. You wouldn't want to work with an assessor that's only comfortable doing, say, on-prem systems if you have everything hosted across 5 or 6 cloud systems. You don't necessarily have to go with somebody who is very technically vendor specific. So I wouldn't say you have to have an AWS expert to assess AWS, as much as you have to have somebody that understands the environment and understands how the controls are implemented in that, and are able to drill on those types of questions. But very much more, aside from just understanding your technology, is also sort of understanding your organization, and again, looking for that cultural fit, because assessors are going to be in there and they're going to be asking hard questions. They're going to be asking, and maybe even making, the baby is ugly statements, or asking about it. And it has to be an organization that understands what your organization's culture is going to be able to frame those difficult conversations in a way that, first of all, won't offend anybody, right? But more importantly, will actually frame them in a way that will help them see that they need to take action and understand the risk if they don't take action. Because at the end of the day, those are going to be the kind of hard conversations you're going to be having. And if an assessor's just, well, nope, this requirement says you need to do this, and that's that. Those conversations probably aren't going to go well from a perspective of you trying to understand, well, what do I really need to do to make things better? So I would look for that cultural fit really as a very, very strong component there, because you're going to be having very hard conversations potentially, and you want somebody who's able to navigate those waters in a way that will bring your entire organization along, and not necessarily maybe cause some of the folks in the organization, when hearing bad news, to shut down and to start to push against the work that's being done there. And that can happen, where you get internal stakeholders which become, negative stakeholders all of a sudden because they've been ticked the wrong way. You want to make sure that fit really is a nice organic fit to have these kinds of tough conversations.
Yeah, I mean, it just shouldn't be a cookie cutter. There are going to be common practices that are done by assessors. There are some commonalities here, but there needs to be intimacy. There has to be a level of familiarity with what these things mean to the organization. And if you're doing that, then you're going to be in a lot better place, because every recommendation, every finding is going to be specifically in the context of the business, as opposed to, how just because this is a thing that everybody else does. We don't want to, this isn't a popularity contest or posing off somebody. We're trying to solve specific risk issues.
Yeah, it's all about driving change. At the end of the day, all of this is all about driving change for the better, moving your posture forward, making you less, providing less sleepless nights because you have more things covered off. And that's really what it's about. And you want a partner that takes that attitude as you go through the journey.
Great. Well, Jill, do we have any other questions?
Nope, that was it.
All right. Well, terrific. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it. I hope everyone is having a safe and happy holiday season, taking care of each other. And please join us for the webinar in January. All this stuff is going to be on the website. If anybody wants to take a look at it after the fact, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions at all. Happy to take those offline questions. And I guess if that's it, we will see you all in the new year. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.